everyone, I'm Nitahone, and today is Friday, so that means it's time for one of my MTG Top 10s. This week we're looking at some of the worst cards in the game instead of some of the best. I ran a poll between Instants and Enchantments to see a worst video about, and Enchantments won in the end. In this video we're going to look at my picks for the 10 worst enchantments ever. There are over 1,000 enchantments in Magic, and there are a lot of bad ones, but these are the worst of the worst. To come up with this list, I find cards that never saw play in Constructed, weren't good in Limited, and see very little play in EDH. I feel that a card meeting all three of these criteria is a great judgment of how good a card is, especially not seeing play in EDH, because lots of bad cards see play there because they happen to synergize well with a particular strategy or commander. The cards in this list barely see any play in EDH, and that's a pretty good indication of how bad they are. A few other things before we get started on this list. I didn't include auras at all because I feel like that should be its own list. I also didn't want to include enchantments that are only good if you are playing more than one copy of a card in your deck, because they are at a natural disadvantage in EDH, so a card like Search the City is not included. I also didn't include enchantments that host particular mechanics that turned out to never be good. This means basically any enchantment that turns off Landwalk was not eligible for this list, nor were cards like Root Cage. If I included these types of cards in my look at the worst enchantments ever, they would basically make up the entire list, so by excluding them from the list, we end up with something a little more interesting. Now, let's look at our first terrible enchantment. At number 10, we have the only blue enchantment to make the list, Deep Water. For 2 blue mana, you get an enchantment that basically does nothing. For a single blue, you can make all your lands produce blue instead of their other colors, but if you already cast this, you had 2 blue mana lying around, and you also have other blue mana to use this ability, why do you need even more blue mana? This card is just a waste of space, and as a result, it only sees play in 13 decks on EDH Rec, and the decks of people who I can only assume really like losing. At number 9, we have the only mono-black enchantment to make the list, Oath of Limb Duel. For 3 and a black, an enchantment that lets you pay 2 black to draw a card would, admittedly, be a good card. Because of that, they tried to weaken this by giving it a major downside, and it is way too much of one. Anytime you take damage, you have to sacrifice a permanent, and you can't sacrifice the Oath to it either, which would make this card much more reasonable. You could just decide to sacrifice it as soon as you take damage, and stop having to deal with this. But you can't sacrifice the Oath. Keep in mind also, this doesn't prevent the damage like Lich does. You take the damage and lose permanence. That type of downside turned a card into one that would be really good into a waste of cardboard. At number 8, we have the only gold enchantment to make the list, Reckless Assault. So for 4 mana, including 2 different colors of mana, you get an enchantment that asks you to pay 1 mana and 2 life to do, what, draw a card? No, that would be pretty good. Instead, you just get to ping things. So yes, you're doing more damage to yourself than you were doing to your opponent or their creatures. This card would have been a little more interesting if it had no mana cost at all. Instead, you just paid 2 life. But as it is, it's pretty terrible. It's just too expensive to cast, and asking you to pay 1 in addition to 2 life pushes this card into completely unplayable territory. At number 7, we have the only green card to make the list, Cycle of Life. This is a 3-mana enchantment that has to balance itself to put a +1/+1 counter on one of your creatures during your next upkeep. That would already be a bad card, maybe not worst ever, but bad. It doesn't immediately put the counter on your creature, and sure, if you have tons of mana lying around, you can do this over and over again, and that does seem kind of fun. But in addition to that, it also turns the creature you want to put the counter on into a 0/1 until your next upkeep. So not only do you not get the counter, you effectively cast a removal spell on your creature and let your opponent have an easier time attacking you. They can also pick it off more easily since it's a 0/1. The only place this might be kind of fun is in an Enchantress deck where you draw a card every time you play an enchantment, but there are way better options out there than this piece of garbage. At number 6, we have the first of 5, that's right, 5 white cards to make the list. White has a lot of bad enchantments, but white also has the most enchantments, so it kind of makes sense that there would be more bad ones. And yeah, obviously this one is bad. It's Security Detail, which makes you pay 6 mana for a single 1/1 white soldier token, and 3 of it has to be white. On top of that, you can only use the ability when you have no other creatures in play. So yeah, the one place it might have been good, a token-heavy deck maybe, you will never be able to use the ability because, well, you'll have a bunch of tokens in play. This would have been able to enable some silly combos if you could do it more than once a turn, but they decided they wanted to make this completely unplayable instead, and you can only do it once a turn, which means it is garbage. So at number 5, we have Fasting, a card that lets you skip your draw step to get some extra bonuses. Usually those kinds of cards are powerful, right? Yeah, usually. This one isn't. Instead, you just get to gain 2 life if you decide not to draw a card, and then if you draw a card for any reason, Fasting gets destroyed. So that's bad. And also, you can only keep it in play for 5 turns, because why not limit a card that's already terrible? Yeah, I mean, you can gain a little bit of life with this, but it's just not worth it. It's much better to draw a card than gain 2 life in 99.9% of scenarios. At number 4, I've included 2 cards from the same cycle, Pyromania and Mortophobia. These are part of a cycle of 5 cards in each color from Torment. All of the cards in the cycle depict a psychological disorder, and all of them involve paying a cost and discarding cards for an effect, and could also be sacrificed for an effect. 4 of the cards in the cycle are terrible. The blue one's the only good one, but these 2 are the worst in the cycle and are played the least in EDH. Pyromania is the only card in the cycle that makes you randomly discard cards instead of choosing cards, and yeah, sure, that feels red, but it really weakens the card. It would actually be decent if you got to choose what to discard. You could play it in like a Madness deck or something, but you don't, and it only does 1 damage to a creature or player every time you use the ability. It's sort of like Reckless Assault, which we looked at earlier, in that it asks you for a huge payment for only a single damage. Honestly, Mortophobia may actually be worse. It just provides graveyard hate, which isn't even relevant all the time, but Mortophobia sees a bit more play than Pyromania does. At number 3, we continue with another white enchantment, Convalescence. Life gain isn't very good in the vast majority of situations, the exceptions being when you have life gain synergies, or the life gain is attached to a useful card. Convalescence doesn't do either of those things. Why? Well, because it is stone useless unless you're at 10 or less life, and once you're there, it gains you 1 whole life on your upkeep. Once you're back above 10, it becomes useless again, and that's bad. It doesn't fit into life gain decks either, because those decks never really want to get to 10 to begin with, and the payoff once you're there just isn't worth it. At number 2, we have a card that is actually worth something on this list, but it isn't because it's good, and that card is Spiritual Sanctuary. The Sanctuary is on the reserve list, and as a result, it will never be reprinted, so if anyone wants to complete their Legends collection, they have to fork over about $16 to buy this piece of garbage. Like Convalescence, it gains you a whopping 1 life at a time, and at least in this case, it just always does it, right? Yeah, I guess, but it also lets your opponent gain 1 life at a time if they control planes, and it costs a whopping 4 mana for a terrible effect. And at number 1, we have a card that only sees play in 2 decks on EDHREC, and that is Unlikely Alliance. So you can pay 1 and a white to give a non-attacking, non-blocking creature +0/+2, and that's in addition to the 1 and a white you pay to cast this thing. What's the point in pumping a creature who isn't attacking or blocking? Well, I guess you could use it to help your creature survive a damage-based clearing effect like Wildfire, but yeah, that's not really worth it. You can also technically use this before attacking or blocking with a creature, and it does keep the bonus, but +0/+2 is just not a relevant stats boost in most cases, and this one is very restrictive. It would be a lot stronger if you could use it once your creature's actually blocking, because then you can do it in response to things, but it doesn't work out that way. Well, that does it for this MTG Top 10. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future MTG Top 10s, don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for watching.